Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 129, Channeling Emotional Contagion with Dr. Gary Seighman. There is an often felt but rarely quantified sense within ensemble music experiences that something truly magical is happening that changes us profoundly. However, recent scientific discoveries are adding a more concrete validity to that which experienced musicians already intuitively know. Studies that reveal the physiological and psychological processes of cooperative effort, especially musical collaboration. The implications of these ideas are beginning to shape our very definition of ensemble. While providing new understandings of the benefits of the group musical expression on the individual, Dr. Gary Seighman joins me to make some truly crucial observations about our art form and the human instrument. From Gary's Choral Journal article discussed later in the episode, I'm quoting, "Presently, topics pertaining to musical perception and creativity are highly popular in neuroscience research. A major development in the field was the proposing of a human mirror neuron system. After the discovery in rhesus monkeys of mirror neurons that fire during both action and observation of motor behavior, scientists detected a similar working system in the fronto-parietal region of human brains." This is a very fascinating conversation that I think you are going to be able to take ideas out of into conversations with and experiences with your students. So stick around and listen all the way to the end. Before we get into that conversation, of course, don't forget to use your promo code at sightreadingfactory.com when you get your membership. Every single time you sign up, I want you to throw Choralosophy in that discount code. That helps the show a lot, and it gives you a discount. And you could do the same thing at the other websites that sponsor this show, mymusicfolders.com. You can get a discount when you get all their choir folders. Sheet music at ryanmain.com and graphitepublishing.com. You can throw the promo code in there as well. And of course, don't forget to head over to Choralosophy Patreon group, which is patreon.com/Choralosophy, and sign up for $3 a month or more and support financially the costs, the recurring costs of doing the show. It really, really helps a lot. The producers at Patreon are Brannigan Lawrence, Brian Long, Venture Studios, John Warner, Jonah Clixbull, Ulrika Igrain, Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, James Mock, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik. Okay, everybody, I am here with Gary Seighman, and we are going to be talking about the science of ensemble and the science of choral music, because as many of you know, I'm a huge nerd about anything that we can back up what we do for a living with some facts, and helping people understand that we're not just standing in a room randomly and singing and hoping for the best, but there's science to it. So Gary, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of share this information. Something, again, that's something that's always been a passion of mine. As well, and ways maybe hopefully some listeners will be able to get some practical kind of ideas out of it.
Yeah, the way I see this concept is that not only is it good to know the science of what it is that you do for a living, no matter what your job is, but it's good to know it for your own benefit, because then hopefully it helps us become better practitioners of what we do. But it's also, in our case, because we have students, I think something we should be passing knowledge along to our students about. Okay, so this thing that we did that worked, why did it work? Why did it not work? Those types of things that's the scientific method, is we are experimenting. Every day we go into a rehearsal. So I'm excited to dig into this. Okay, so before we do that though, who are you and where do you come from and what do you do every day?
So Gary Seighman, I teach at Trinity University here in San Antonio, Texas. I'm not originally a Texan. I actually grew up in the Northeast and just kind of made my way down here. I've been here, a director of choral activities here for 14 years. Small private school, about 2,500 students, almost primarily undergraduate students. And, my ensembles, like many of your, people you've had on before, they spread the gamut in terms of, biochem, entrepreneurship majors, business majors, engineering, obviously my music education majors and so forth. But we spread the gamut around campus on that.
Right. That's great. That's great. So was your interest in this topic of kind of explaining the science behind ensemble music making something that existed in you earlier in your career, or was it something you did as part of research for grad school, or how did that come about for you?
I've always been a nerd with that kind of stuff. Even through middle school and high school, I always loved math and science. In fact, I thought I was going to do that originally for a career. I thought I was going to go to engineering. I tell my students a lot. And it kind of basically, I applied to engineering schools. I got into the ones I wanted to go to, but I'm going on these, college searches with my dad. And instead of asking about the engineering labs, I'm asking what the choir rooms look like. And I think my dad's kind of behind me, kind of shaking his head a little bit, like what's going on here. This is, the mid 90s. And so actually during the Clinton years when there were defense cutbacks and so actually, had a better job getting a music teaching position than an engineering position at the time. So for my family, it was a very practical decision. And my choir director who put the bug in me early on, but I just never really thought it was something I really wanted to do until I was like, I needed to make a decision right away. So I applied to one music school where he went, got in, and then it was from there. But I've always had this love of science. And I guess this particular interest of mine has just only emerged in the past maybe 7 or 8 years. Just as I kind of got my feet wet in understanding, what some of the things I was doing, why weren't they working, why some of the things I was doing were working, and delving a little bit into it. And I've always been, this one who I'd love to kind of, steal ideas from things outside of music, and being in a school, art school where I'm at now, it's really kind of conducive for the environment where I can, pick the brains of some of my students who are studying all different kinds of things. And I love listening to, Star Talk. I'm a huge Star Talk fan with Neil deGrasse Tyson and things like that. Whatever, if I could take some little nugget and kind of somehow incorporate that in my daily life as a choral director, I love that. And I think our students really appreciate that as well.
Yeah, that sounds like something I would be very much into as well if I were in your class. So that's very cool. So here's how I'm going to start. You had a Choral Journal article not too long ago. Let's see, what year was it? 2019?
2015.
2015. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to read for the audience, since most of them will not see anything visual, the opening paragraph, because I think it's kind of a good starting point for people to understand what it is that you mean when you're talking about the science of ensemble. So it says, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Musicians in ensemble settings have felt this awareness for centuries. However, recent scientific studies are validating this adage by revealing the physiological and psychological processes of cooperative effort, especially musical collaboration. The implications of these ideas are beginning to shape our very definition of ensemble, while providing new understandings of the benefit of group musical expression on the individual. Presently, topics pertaining to musical perception and creativity are highly popular in neuroscience research. So I find that particularly interesting as a way to start, because one of the things that I've been noticing too is that in education more broadly, but definitely in music education, you're exactly right. And what you write there is a ton of science available to us to understand what it is that we're teaching and why it works or doesn't work. My concern, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on to have this conversation, is I feel like not enough of us who do it are actually interested in that science. And so let's evangelize a little bit. So what are some of the things that you really like to teach fellow teachers about in this area?
I think, a lot of this is very new in the past decade or so, because the technology of a lot of the neuroscience research is allowing us to do things such as, with fast capture cameras and so forth, to know that there's a lot of communication happening between our ensemble members and between them and us that we can't see on a normal basis just by watching it. There's a lot of subconscious cues that are happening between them, and ways in which they're starting to converge emotionally. And so, years back, with this term emotional contagion came out, and this idea that people mimic each other's behaviors. And you see this in conversations, where people are sitting at a coffee table, having a drink, and one person will kind of lean into the table and the other person will subconsciously do the same. Or their speech speed will start to synchronize. Even the vocalization, how high they're speaking, how low they're speaking, will start to synchronize. The postures and all that will start to synchronize. And the whole point of this is that it helps facilitate communication between those people, because you're putting yourself in the other person's shoes, whether you're aware of that or not consciously. And so that breaks that barrier and allows that information to come in more closely. And so no more than in a choral classroom do you see this happening on a larger scale. And if I may just part of the scientists discovered years ago these things called mirror neurons, and they discovered them in monkeys. And that's where this is the science behind this idea. It's not just a theory. I mean, there's been hundreds of peer-reviewed journal articles about this emotional contagion. This idea that when one monkey is seeing another one doing some kind of activity, that the brain distinguishes a little between them seeing the activity or them doing the activity themselves. And these are called mirror neurons because they're basically mirroring that. And so they believe that there's a similar system in humans that does the same thing. I always use the example of when you're driving on the street. I drive on I-10 every morning to school, and you ever get the sense that the car in front of you is about to cut in front of you, but you're not really sure why. This sixth sense about it, and you're kind of prepping yourself for that. Well, part of that is you're subconsciously, you might be seeing the car maybe swerving slightly a little bit on the road, or you may notice this driver's a little distracted or something like that, but you're not really thinking about that on the conscious level. But what your body is doing, it's priming itself so that when that person does slam the brakes and cut in front of you, that you're halfway ready to turn on the brakes and so forth. And so these things are happening all the time, and we're talking about milliseconds, but in driving that makes a big difference. And so forth. And so I argue that the same thing is happening in ensembles. And a lot of research, especially out of the UK from 2013 on through, has been discovering a lot of that. And of course, there's lots of things that we as music educators have talked about with terms of people synchronizing with their different chemical levels and so forth. And singers begin to synchronize with each other, and it's a de-stressor, and all these studies have come out from that.
Yeah. Now, isn't there a parallel actually for that mirroring concept in the voice itself, where, and I think I read about this at some point, but correct me if I'm wrong, where like if I hear us singing happening subconsciously without me even knowing, the muscles of my larynx start to move in mimic of what it is that I'm hearing. Have you heard of that?
Exactly so. And that's why if you're hearing, say, a soprano or a tenor singing sharp, your own larynx starts to pull up a little bit, right? Because what our body does is it starts to understand the amount of friction, the amount of musculature that's required to make a particular sound. Now, how detailed we of understanding we have depends upon our training. So if I'm listening to a timpanist on for playing on stage for a symphony, I can kind of somewhat sense when I'm hearing them hitting away. I can somewhat sense the kind of amount of pressure that they would need to make this sound and so forth. But if I'm a trained timpanist listening to it, I can very clearly understand, okay, so this is what they're feeling on their elbow and so forth. And it's the exact same thing with singing. Exactly.
Yeah. And I noticed there's a little section in the Choral Journal article talking about ways that this concept or this idea can be applied in speech therapy. Now, are we making the connection? Is the idea that we can make the connection between speech therapy and singing, or how would you tie that together? How would you tie what we do together with speech therapy?
The speech therapy part in the article is because the idea that people who have trouble stuttering, for example, if they hear an outside stimulus, for example, if they hear someone speaking with them, or if they're watching somebody's mouth moving but on mute, that their stuttering decreases, dramatically. And that's partially because, again, they're taking some of those cues from that person and so forth, and they're internalizing some of it, and so the stuttering goes away magically. Or if they have hear an oral signal at a certain pitch and so forth, it will go away. So that's kind of the connection, how it relates to the emotional contagion part.
Yeah, and I would imagine then if we take that same idea into a choral rehearsal, that would be things like some of the activities that we all intuitively do, like, hey, watch across the choir for the shape of each other's mouth, right? Well, but it's not. That's kind of what I think of it as. That's the why behind why we do that. That's why that matters and why it helps. And of course, that creates the other issue of why that was such a challenge during the pandemic with masks. We no longer could do that.
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly. I mean, I always tell my singers to pod up. And when they pod up, that means they stay in smaller groups within their section. And I have them watching each other's mouths. Exactly. Because, again, this idea of emotional contagion, if they're watching each other's mouths, yeah, you're going to get a unified vowel, which is, your primary goal. But at the same time, there's also this other communication happening between them, which has been clinically proven. And I have a whole bunch of kind of fun studies that kind of show different aspects of how that works out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And of course, there's so much we can learn in real time too. I mean, these things can happen, without even having to stop and talk about them. kids and or young adults or adults can notice these things happening in real time and make these adjustments. And that could even work just by holding up a mirror to the student too, which is interesting. What is muscular bonding? What does that mean?
So muscular bonding it's the idea that these quick things that happen in which we're starting to mimic each other happens at a rate that's faster than just pure reflexes or pure reaction time. That we literally are kind of putting ourselves in another person's shoes to make these adjustments. There was a great study done. They had 2 trained actors, and both actors were told, just go ahead and mimic each other. That's all they were told to do. And they had a video camera on them. And so they were able to mimic each other's movements, hand movements, eye coordination, so forth, within 40 milliseconds apart, which is less than a frame in a movie, in a high definition movie, which is amazing in itself. And then the best part of the study is then they did again, same actors. They said, okay, this time you're going to do the moving, and you're going to follow this person. And so one would think, okay, so now they each have their role, and it's going to even be better. Well, actually, the synchronization was nowhere close then. Because then not only that, but then their movements became more restrained. They kind of got nervous because one person was kind of behind the other person, and so there was less actual size of the movement, and they weren't synchronized together. And so this idea the researchers came up with is the idea that there's a sense of co-leadership. That when both of them had this objective, which was to stay together, to mimic each other, then that proved to get to this incredibly tight accuracy in terms of their synchronization. But then the moment that one person was in charge of leading as a conductor, say showing the beat or something like that, the other person was completely behind. And so this idea of muscular bonding, in which they literally were almost becoming infused together from that.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And of course, this might tie into your pods idea that you were talking about before. And also in the article, you talk about the idea of chamber music, where this happens, of course, all the time. There, of course, in the choral world, it's a little bit less common, but there are, of course, the unconducted small ensembles, your chanticleer, your voce eight, or something like that, where they're doing those types of co-leadership, I guess you could say. Or is that an example directly in your understanding of musical or muscular bonding?
Exactly, it is. And you have like groups like the Orpheus Ensemble, which is the conductorless orchestra, and so forth. And it really begins to put on our minds as conductors is what is our role, because it obviously affects our role. If the person is standing in front of the groups, so if they're capable of doing this, that redefines what our role is as conductors.
Yeah, I'm fully on board with that concept and have been for years, where I try to conduct as little as possible, simply because even with kids, because I want them to be A, not dependent on me, but B, start to become more aware of each other and what they're doing. And so, I think that's a really, really beneficial thing. And I don't know, at least for me, and I want to know your opinion too, but at least for me, it doesn't really change my role as far as the leader of the ensemble, because they do still look to me to make certain types of decisions and put breath marks in or whatever. But at the same time, there is a sense of ownership that comes from allowing certain musical things to happen organically. Is that something that you ever experiment with in your own choirs, or how does that work in your choirs?
A perfect example is, if we're going through this a few days ago with my rehearsal, we were rehearsing a piece with my chamber singers, and it was this Caroline Shaw to the hands, and there's really kind of complicated section. The sopranos were doing sextuplets and all that, and they just weren't together, and I was kind of showing the beat and all that, and so I just stopped conducting, and I said, okay, you all do it. And they nailed it. They nailed it the first time.
Yep.
It's humbling. And it was a trick. Christoph Dignani, who was the conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra, he did a documentary, and he did the same. He's rehearsing with the orchestra, and they're doing this Haydn passage over and over and over again. Wasn't together. And he just sat down and said, "Okay, play," and it was perfect. And what that did was, I at that point was becoming the distraction in terms of, at that point they didn't need me. They needed to be watching each other. They needed to be literally physically moving their bodies with each other, watching each other's faces, their mouths, and so forth to get that rhythm. And in that sense, I was the hindrance there.
Yeah, I've had the same experience where sometimes I'll just be in front of the choir and be frustrated, and I'll just sometimes it'll dawn on me that I am only in the way right now. Is it because in some ways, I'm creating a delay that the kids have to look at me, get information, and then change what they're doing and send the information back, which is just a middleman that isn't needed in some situations. That doesn't happen all the time. It's not true all the time. But so I will just step away and say, guys, I'm in the way. You're on your own. And oftentimes you're exactly the same experience you had. It might get better instantly. Mm-hmm. And I think yeah, go. And I was just going to say that, and this would be, correct me if I'm wrong again, but to me, that's just another example of them being aware of each other creates or facilitates, I should say, this idea of muscular bonding. Is that, am I getting it right?
Exactly. And you mentioned the word delay, and actually our life as conductors actually revolves around that delay. Mm-hmm. That's the whole point. You know, if we made a gesture at literally the exact moment they were making a sound, we're not showing them anything, right? Because they're already making the sound. Our job is in all the preparatory motion, right? And it kind of goes into this idea of inertia, choral inertia, and the fact that actually the ensemble actually creates this cohesive unit amongst themselves before it's with the conductor. And it creates it both physically and it creates it both orally with each other. And so you see this with orchestras all the time. When you're watching an orchestra conductor and they show the ictus, and it feels like an eternity before the players play that downbeat, right? And you think, what's going on during that time? And what's actually happening is the orchestra is they're taking that information, you know, cognitively, but then they're orally connecting with each other, physically and orally with each other, taking the information from the conductor. All that information is coming in through like a little processor, and then it's coming out. Mm-hmm. And so that it's actually the envelope of time, which is actually allows us to actually make changes. I equate it to being the person laying down the railroad track as the train is coming along, right? You're the ones, you know, there's a retard coming over. I'm going to move the train track a little bit to the left, just ahead of the choir, and vice versa. And so that frees us up from having to sit there and just show four patterns all the time, but to actually begin to show larger structures and larger forms and actually showing something rather than just being static.
Right. Absolutely. What is the role of the breath in all of this process when we're singing and muscularly coordinating?
Again, the breath is this idea of, you know, that's part of the preparation for the singer. And I think the breath is important, but I think so much is also just the physical sensation of the singers moving. And when they're breathing, they're moving together and just allowing that breath as opportunity for the singers to connect before they make the sound.
Mm-hmm.
And
No, I was going to say, and that's also this is where we get some of that physiological bonding as well, is that when our breath synchronizes, weird stuff starts to happen in our bodies. Is that right?
I think so, and that's part of just kind of conducting has always been kind of, you know, as an undergrad, I went to Westminster Choir College, and honestly, at the time when I was there, it always felt like this sense of like, oh, it was like this magical art that you were bequeathed upon, and so forth, and you had to be the select few to get it, and so forth, and it's not a magic. I mean, there's the science now can validate a lot of the stuff that's actually happening. You know, in terms of, you know, when you're watching, you know, the conductor, you know, of the New York Philharmonic, and it's so not textbook of what you would teach your conducting students, but there's a reason why it works, and now we're starting to understand some of the science behind why that works.
Yeah, and of course with the breath, there's connections to heart rate. There's connections to, you know, just the oxygenation of the blood starts to become more consistent across the entire choir because everybody's taking similar types of breaths at similar times. And so in quite literal, but also spiritual ways, we're kind of tuning our bodies to each other, which is, I mean, kind of borderline creepy to say, but that's essentially what's happening. And it's a very intimate connection because of the breath.
If I can go back, so you mentioned about the breath, the fact that when we do breathe together and when you aren't inhaling and exhaling at the same time, that synchronizes that, but also begins to synchronize your heartbeat. And there's actually an actual mechanism in the body that creates that. And there was this incredible study in the UK in 2013 in which they had choral singers actually where they were testing their heart rate variability. They were testing and all different things. And they found that even when they were just looking at the researchers were watching just the rates, where they were watching the singers or the music, but they were just watching the heart rates. They were able to distinguish what the singers were doing, which singers were singing together, and so forth, just based upon their heart rates, which were becoming synchronized from singing together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I agree. I think we're kind of scratching the surface in the last few years of what it is that we're going to know about our art form. And now I hinted at this at the beginning, but I think one of my concerns is I guess I'm saying that as a aspirational statement. I hope that we are just scratching the surface. But of course, for us in our profession, we would have to start caring about this like a lot, because in a lot of ways. So I'm going to give you an example. As many people who listen to the show know, I'm really big. One of my big crusades is literacy. And I think that it's a really important thing for all students, and not just because it helps make our choirs better, but because there are neurological benefits. There are social benefits. There are emotional benefits from being able to master a skill. And that's really critical. Now, in literacy, there is a ton over the last 30 years of neurological research that explains very, very clearly how it is that we read. And ideas around reading music being no different than reading any other language. And I every time I bring it up to choir directors, they have no idea what I'm talking about. And it's the science of reading, the concept of phonics and sounding out words, and all of that kind of stuff is exactly what we do when we are reading and when we're becoming literate musicians. So the reason that concerns me, though, is that I think that if our organizations like ACDA or Chorus America don't throw their resources behind some of this research, we're gonna have to continue to borrow research from other fields and extrapolate it onto what we do, rather than, because I would love some massive study specifically studying the neurology of music reading or ensemble singing or whatever, rather than extrapolating from the outside. Is that something you've ever thought about or come across?
During the pandemic, actually, I have a 5 and a 7-year-old now. And so we homeschooled them that first fall of 2020. Mm-hmm. And that was just when he was, kind of in kindergarten. And so my wife and I were, teaching them at home and teaching them phonics. And so after a late, long day at school, we were at home, my wife and I at night, kind of look up phonics lessons, kind of making up on the fly mm-hmm. for our kids. And it was hard. Oh my gosh. It was so, to have to think about it and reduce it down to those small forms to teach it to your kid. And in a way, it was very, very similar to when I'm looking at a piece of music and I'd say, okay, I'm going to do this much of an umlaut on this vowel and so forth. And, but just to break it down into those pieces, it was hard. It gave me a new respect for early reading teachers and patience, I guess, as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's an issue, a concern in the field of elementary school education too, because in most elementary schools, they're not teaching phonics. Mm-hmm. They're teaching the cueing system. Yeah. And of course, now we've known for 30 years that it doesn't work. But it's just one of those things where I was taught that way in college, so I'm going to teach that way when I'm in school, and the cycle repeats. And of course, we're always fighting that battle in choral music too. And one of the things I was excited about when I saw your article was that this is the kind of stuff that I think that we should be spending most of our time and energy learning. Is being able to explain to a layperson what is going on in our choir rooms in a way that people outside of the choir world would understand. So, for example, just being able to talk about the physiological changes when we breathe, being able to figure out talk about the neurology of learning to read music. All these things we need to be well versed in talking about them. And so I think this is really good and really important. Okay. Of course, throw thoughts in as you have them. You're totally allowed to do that. But I do want to ask about another one of your little points here. So we got to the breathing, and then there's a section in there where you talk about facial muscles. What are we doing with each other's facial muscles I'm assuming that we're not super aware that we're doing?
So there's a biofeedback mechanism with facial muscles. We once thought that we have a certain emotion and then we evoke the facial muscle to match it. We're happy, so we smile. Mm-hmm. But we now know it actually goes both ways. And there have been studies done in which they had a group of people, they had to read through an excerpt, and they were told they needed to make a smiling face the entire time during the excerpt. And then they're asked questions about that. And then they had the same group of people, same excerpt, but this time they needed to make frowning faces. The group that had to smile, they found the more positive aspects to relate to in the passage. Those who are in a frowning state found the more negative elements within that reading. And so we know it's this two-way street, which is remarkable. And so again, I mean, I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface in terms of what that means in a choral situation. When you have an entire tenor section matching that exact same facial muscles, sorry, I sound like Sean Connery. Those facial muscles, that now we know there's something emotionally that's going to start connecting all of them together. Right. And whether in 20 or 30 or 40 years, whether we actually have the tools scientifically to be able to somehow quantify that, who knows? Because there's, again, you said it's in real time. I think you had a guest, I think it was Metzger a few weeks ago. You talked about vulnerability in real time. I think that was your quote. And it's the same thing. All this is happening in real time. And so to measure these things is going to be, just a crazy, ridiculously set of complex variables to do that. Yeah. But we know that there is something with that, with these facial muscles. I'm going to throw another study. This actually blew my mind. They took 26 native German speakers, and they had to read a passage which had a much higher percentage of umlauts in them. As we all know, umlauts, the U vowel, it creates a nostril constriction, which actually lowers it decreases the airflow into the sinuses. And so they measured the temperature of their foreheads. And so when these speakers had passages with a lot more umlauts, their foreheads were warmer because of all these umlauts that they were speaking and so forth. And so when they were doing that, then these German speakers similarly had more they interpreted this reading in a different way with more negative connotations, because there was not a sense of pain but a slight sense of discomfort, even that they didn't notice consciously, but it happened because they're reading through all these umlauts. They created this nasal constriction that occurred.
Right. Wow. That's really interesting. So I'm of course I'm trying to think, my mind is spinning right now. I'm just thinking about all the times in the past in my classroom where I've seen different phenomenon like these occur, but didn't know enough about what was going on at the time to point it out. And I hinted at this at the beginning too, but one of the reasons I think we all should know about this stuff is because I think it enriches the classroom when we notice a moment of synthesis like that, or a moment of synergy that we point out. Like, you don't want to ruin the moment by talking about science, but like maybe later when you're thinking back, you remember that yesterday in rehearsal when we just, like, it felt like everyone just loved each other for about 15 seconds and then everybody got stressed again, because like that happens, right? And like, why might that be? Well, there's actually some science that explains why that might have been the case. And then the kids, like, they get really interested because they're like, wow, I didn't know that our emotions were connected to something so cold and unromantic as science. But what that means is that we can then work to recreate those things.
That's just to recreate it is exactly it. And that it's that same idea with when I do the pods, or I do another activity in which if the choir is not quite together and so forth, or I just to get the sense of ownership, where I'll split the choir in half. I'll have half the choir to my left, half the choir to my right, and also I'll have like a full SATB, so that it's its own ensemble. And then we'll go back and forth, and they'll sing like one phrase. This side will sing one phrase, and then the next half will sing the next phrase, and we'll go back and forth and not stop, right? And it forces them to, and for the first time it happens, it's always awful, right? And then they start to realize, okay, so you know what? We need to breathe in the tempo that this group gave us. And then they start to eventually realize, okay, we actually need to start moving. I joke around. I say, okay, move like an amoeba, like with the choir, a giant amoeba. Start to move with each other, and then within minutes, we're doing every other bar back and forth. Right. Wow. And they're audiating, and any group can do this, right? It's just, and because they're audiating and they're moving. And so that again takes away, that creates ownership on them, and it allows me to kind of back out of the way. And then when I want to, show the crescendo or show the phrase, I can do that. And now there's a reason for them to watch me. I gave them a reason for watching me. I feel like, too often we train our singers not to watch us.
Yeah. But it's like, if everything is, it's like when you speak too, if everything's loud, then people tune you out. Or if everything's too soft, everybody tunes you out. It's the monotone conducting also exists. But yeah, no, that's really interesting. In fact, I was going to take us that direction anyway, because I've got one of your handouts here in front of me where you list a bunch of just like ideas to try. And it's because what right now, this podcast is kind of, I'm going to divide it up into two chunks. So we just talked about a lot of the background of the ideas that you're sharing, but now let's talk about some things people should try. And so we just got the conducting one, which is to be careful that your conducting patterns are not too big all the time, so that people are trained to then respond to what happens when you do something emotive, so to speak. So I'm going to rattle some off, and then I want you to kind of explain what you mean.
Okay.
So be aware of your own mood. Why does that matter?
I think no more. I taught in New Jersey. I taught high school in New Jersey for all, and I had to drive on Route 22 where I had the worst traffic. And there were days when I know I was showing up to my first period or my second period class just completely like this, from traffic. And if you show up like that, the singers, we know now from the science, and that there's gonna be a sense of anxiety just from they're gonna sense it from you, right? And so being aware that every little thing that you bring to the rehearsal, they're going to mimic in some capacity, and so forth. So you want to be aware of that, and even just the room itself, the organization of the room. If the room is disorganized, we know that student behavior is not going to be as good as if the room was organized, and there's been studies about that as well.
Yeah. I hear a lot of discussion about, of course, as choir directors, we want to be, or as teachers in general, we want to be our authentic selves. But on the flip side of that, we have a responsibility that is different than everyone else in the room, because in a lot of ways, our emotional state will set the tone for how that class and that rehearsal goes. So I would say there are some places and times where we need to fake it. Mm-hmm. But then what the cool thing about that though, is that based on all this science that we've just been talking about, if we're able to initiate that calmness, that even if it's fake, then the students might send it back to us. And by the end of rehearsal, it's not fake anymore, because we've just been energized by each other's presence. It's the coolest thing. It is absolutely the coolest thing. Okay, I've got another one here. The importance of you, and this is actually on a similar line of thinking here, but the importance of you as the conductor or the teacher, modeling and even mimicking back to them proper everything. So proper alignment, proper technique, relaxation of the jaw and articulator muscles, all the different things that they might be seeing while they're trying to sing. What are some pitfalls that sometimes we might fall into if we're not careful there?
Well, and this is just, a lot of us, are familiar with Rodney Eichenberger's, what they see is what you get.
Yep.
Right? And where they would have, one, they had one camera on the conductor, another camera on the singers, and they'd watch the conductor. The conductor would be told to kind of drop their posture deliberately. And then you see the choir do the same thing. Right. And I'd done a couple of summer workshops, as a participant with him. And it's miraculous to see, to notice, how the ensemble will mimic the conductor's movements and so forth. And so this is just basically the science behind that, and the little things, even in rehearsal, even as a conductor, when I just kind of fix myself up, everyone just kind of fixes themselves up and so forth. And even, if it's something when it's, a choral piece and, just showing the vowels sometimes with your mouth and so forth. I mean, you don't want to mouth the words all the time, but, there are times when it's going to be very beneficial when they're going to see that, they're going to mimic it and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about the idea of encouraging students to visually interact with each other? What are some ways that you accomplish this in your rehearsal, other than you've talked about the pods earlier? Are there any other? I'll throw out before you respond. In high school, this is one of our big challenges because they feel so awkward at first. Even looking at anyone or being looked at while they're singing, and so we have to get over that hurdle. But I can tell you, at the high school level, once you cross that hurdle, there so many things get easier. How does that manifest itself in your rehearsals?
Very similar. I mean, I told you I taught high school for years in New Jersey, and my singers now, I have singers of all different disciplines. I have singers in my training choir who are brand new to singing this semester, singing next to some of my music majors. And so I had the gamut of them. And so there's that sense of, how comfortable they are singing even just in a group, some of them, they get intimidated sitting next to each other. But one thing you mentioned that I do to kind of get them moving and so forth, and it's always kind of fun to do this is, and I'll do it from dramatic effect once in a while for them, but and my older singers will pretty quickly get going on what I'm doing, is if something's not going right or something like that, I'll sit down. Okay, I'll just tell the choir, okay, you start it. I'll just say that, and I'll sit down, and they're all watching me, and they're waiting for me to kind of cue them or give an ictus, and I look at them and be like, "We'll go." Yeah. And then
what are you waiting for?
Yeah, and then a couple of my exactly like just sing, and they're all like, "Well, what do we do?" And then of course my student leaders will kind of start to show stuff. No, I don't want anybody to everyone just start together, and it takes about 6 or 7 tries, and they'll kind of like look at each other, and they'll finally, okay, they'll come in again. And the first 6 or 7 times will be awful, and then eventually, they'll get it. They'll get it. And it does take time out of rehearsal, but it does nail a point that I try to get to them, is the fact that, I'm not needed in many ways, and I tell them, if I drop dead during the concert, my wish is that you keep singing. Yeah. And so, the idea that now they're, by the 6th or 7th time, what they're doing is they're in a circle, they're looking at each other. And then, like you said before, they're breathing together, and then they'll get it, and so that's one way that I get them to kind of create that cohesive thing. I'd say it will take, 6 or 7 minutes, if not more, out of your rehearsal time, but it's worth it. It's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of them that I really like is that you're giving the advice that we should think about varying how we use sectionals. In other words, I think maybe the conventional wisdom is that you use sectionals at the very beginning of the process, and only just to learn notes. Like, maybe it just, as long as we got the notes and rhythms right in the sectional, we're done with sectionals. But it seems here like maybe have a suggestion that's different than that.
I think because often with sectionals, you tend to have 1 or 2 students who will kind of end up leading that on their own, even if you don't assign anyone, someone who's comfortable with the piano or something like that. But you're right. I mean, all we're thinking about in a traditional sectional thing is just the notes and the rhythms. And I'll often just, a week or 2 before the concert, I'll say, okay, tenors, go over there and just, sing through that piece and work out some of the issues that they come across with. And so they're very quickly thinking about things about like vowel modification, and they're starting to kind of work on those higher level things beyond notes and pitches. And then it gives some of the students who maybe wouldn't necessarily speak out because they're not, a pianist or something like that, someone who might have a really good ear for tuning or for vowels or so forth. Like, you know what, guys, we're not much that the A vowel needs to be more close to an E vowel, and they can really fine tune things and work in a deeper level, with the musicianship, because they're not worried about the notes and rhythms, because no matter how much sometimes you want to tell them about, this and this, when at the early process, they're more worried about getting that E natural, right? That isn't to say that we should always, we shouldn't just throw musicality on top, like the cherry on top. We should incorporate as early in the process as possible. But why not do sectionals later on when they're already comfortable with the music, when their ears are finally open now, they're open to start listening because they're not worried about the notes on the page.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is the next step for a lot of kids. And I had a conversation with my students last week about kind of a raw conversation about some of the things that we lost during the pandemic. And for my seniors, that was their sophomore year that we lost most school, like the most of the time together we lost was their sophomore year. And one of the things we reflected on was that we had so little time together in the classroom that ultimately choir oftentimes became just about getting the right notes, because we lost out on so much time, and that we felt like we were doing everything we could just to get the right notes so that we could sing something short and easy at a concert, because it was just not enough time. And so then now, of course, we've had normal school, like full-time in person for a year and a half, and things are kind of feeling more like normal, but we sometimes have to reflect that our habit sometimes is still to revert back to, well, I got the notes and rhythms right. What else is there to do? Because and I explained to them, you learned that, unfortunately, because I didn't mean to teach you that, but that's what we learned during the pandemic. But we have to move beyond that. Yeah, it's a sad reality, but it is a reality. And speaking of those, actually leads accidentally very well into the next one I was going to ask you about, because for me, that the pandemic brings up very negative emotions. And I like to be open with my kids about when I'm feeling negative emotions. One of the pointers that you give in this, I think this ties into the idea that we were talking about earlier of how emotions are contagious within a room. And so what that might sometimes do is it might create us to have the false impression that we need to make it so that our environment is always positive 100% of the time, and that we don't allow any of our negative feelings to ever enter the room. And you seem to think that that's a myth, and I want you to make your case.
For the longest time, I always told my singers, the moment you walk into the choir room, leave all your baggage out there, and we're gonna just make great music. And I'll say that for years. And and there were times in which I realized saying that was, how can you do that if you have a kid who just had a terrible breakup or had a family thing, going on just before the rehearsal? How can you ask them to do that? And it's not fair to them, and I think it puts a big blockade on what's possible with the music, because we can't just turn off. We're gooey creatures, right? We can't just turn off things and just, I'm in the choir, I'm gonna be happy now. And sometimes you need to draw on some of those emotions to really, to evoke. It's like method acting. The idea of maybe thinking upon a memory or something that's going to really get you geared up or fired up or angry to give that performance. And we're not asking our singers to. We're asking our singers to be genuine, but at the same time, we're on stage, and there needs to be a sense of evocation. There needs to be a sense of you need to sometimes draw some that anger from some experience and bring that in with you.
Yeah.
We can't just turn off. And so my feelings of that have actually only changed recently, probably around the pandemic. The same thing, because I had a very frank conversation with my choir, during it. I said, "Yeah, guys, this sucks." This sucks. We're doing the whole virtual choir thing, which we all know is not real choirs anyhow. You're singing your darn phone and all that. But this sucks. So what are we gonna learn from it? And we're gonna learn that there's we're gonna appreciate what we have now more. And we're not, and if we're angry, we're gonna somehow work through that in our rehearsals and maybe work through that in the repertoire.
Yeah. The way I like to explain it is I think of our emotions as magic powers, the way that oftentimes magic powers are displayed in certain types of TV and movie. So imagine the TV and movie archetype where a kid grows up and he knows he's a little bit different than all the other kids. But then when he goes through puberty, he starts to realize he has magic powers, right? And at first, the magic powers are very volatile and he might actually hurt someone or whatever. But then he always meets up with some wiser wizard, for like some older wizard or whatever, who explains to him that you don't suppress the powers. You learn to control them and you learn to use them when you need them. And that's the object of the game. And I think emotions need to be explained in our rehearsals in that way. It's like, yes, as performers, we do have to have the ability to go on stage when we're sad and sing a happy song. We do, but that's not the same as suppressing your emotions so that you don't feel them anymore. And so what we're learning to do is channel them into the music and through the music. Thoughts about my analogy?
I agree. And I think taking it to the next step, the idea of now, okay, so now you have, 50 or 100 people with all these things going on. Now, how are you going to make that into a single cohesive unit? And this idea of, what we preach all the time about choir, the benefits of choir, for singers, what we're learning, those social interpersonal skills and so forth. And the idea of situational awareness, I think, where you're aware of, of your surroundings. I also use the word choir IQ. And this idea, I'm here in San Antonio, so I'm a huge Spurs fan. And so you watch the NBA and they're always talking about basketball IQ. What does that mean? That means always knowing where the other players are on the court, always knowing, where the ball is, being able to empathize with each other. And knowing that, if the player is next to you and you're passing the ball, you're not going to throw the ball as hard as you can to them. You're going to empathize. You might lob it a little later because you're putting yourselves in that person's shoes, that you're going to throw it in a way that they're going to predict how to catch it. Right. And so all these cues going on, and that's just going on with this analogy. And That's what makes this such a powerful art form, is the fact that now we are asked to not only evoke and do that, but also to connect with each other. And it's so powerful. And I think we're getting only scratching the surface in terms of the science behind it. But I think it's something that we just need to be screaming for the mountaintops of the benefits of that, you know. And I see it so much at my university when I'm asked to write letters of recommendation for our pre-med students going into med school and law school and so forth, because grad schools don't want a walking calculator or a walking dictionary. They want to know that this person can communicate and they can work together and they're creative. And so when I'm writing that letter, I can speak to that because they have, I hope to think that they've developed some of those skills in an ensemble setting where they are, you know, sometimes working through those things together and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what's interesting about the choir IQ is that sometimes, just like in basketball, the person in your choir with the highest choir IQ is not the best individually most talented person. The choir IQ is an interesting term that I read. I did see that. I'm glad you brought that up in your materials, because it's a good analogy for the idea that there's more to just choir, or more to choir than just my own solo voice. And how powerful it might be, or even as much as I love literacy, it's more than just about being a good sight reader. There is more to it than that. And so I think that's a really good way to think of choir IQ as boiling all of these concepts into one big area, where if you understand all these things, you've got a high choir IQ. Yeah, that's good.
If I can go back just a little briefly back to the science to it too, there was a study done in Italy among professional basketball players in Italy, in which they are shooting free throws, and they would video the players shooting free throws, but they would stop the video as soon as the ball left their hands, and they stop right there. And so they then they had to watch they had another group of professional players watching the video, and they had to predict whether the ball was going to go in the basket or not, just based upon the video of them getting set, shooting right as the ball leaves the hand. And the professional basketball players were able to determine in a much higher than 50-50 ratio of if the basketball was going to go into the hoop, just based upon the subtleties of watching the ball leaving the person's fingers. And they did the same study with amateurs, people who had no training, and it was 50-50, balls going to go in or not. And so what this means is that there were these certain internal cues that the players who were trained at this were taking in from just the movement of how the ball released, the velocity, that they could then predict about that. And so I argue it's the same thing happening, you know, with our singers, with, you know, we're basketball players on the court, you know, we're moving with each other. If I get the sense that the guy next to me is starting to run out of breath, if I'm really intuitive to it, I can get a sense of that. And so if we're staggering, I'll hold it a little longer, and vice versa. And that happens all the time to us as singers, doesn't it? Where we have these cues in which I better hold on. I have a sense that Dan next to me is not going to carry it through, or I'm running out of breath. He's going to kind of follow through. Right, something's beyond my range where I need to change the vocal call. I'm going to back off a little bit and let him take over. There are millions of these decisions happening all the time, and we can't cognitively be aware of them all the time. And so there's definitely something subconscious happening with that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it just even basic things that we can teach kids over time too, that increase their choir IQ. Like today, in one of the activities that I did as kind of a focus activity, and only the people on my YouTube channel will be able to see this, but I held my mouth in ah position. And of course, I asked what vowel would come out if I started to sing. And I asked that to my beginning kids, and they could all get, you know, there was ah. And I did it with my advanced kids too. But then the next one, I kept my mouth in the same position for ah, and I moved my tongue to position, which is a little bit harder to see because you can only see the tongue move just a little bit. And you can't see the lips move. Now, of course, my advanced kids, because they've been taught that, they knew that I just moved my tongue to position. But the beginning kids were throwing out all kinds of weird guesses. I even got an ooh from a kid. I was like, "Did you see my lips move?" Like, no, but their choir IQ is lower, and so they're not as aware of all of those things and how they would affect the sound. And so I think that's the beauty of it, is that we're teaching kids gradually to build up that wide body of knowledge. Yeah, absolutely. So. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up here with just allowing you to because we covered a lot. And I think we might even overwhelm some people, but talking a little bit about maybe where people could find more information about this. I know there is a Choral Journal article. Why don't you tell people about that? And maybe that would be a good starting place.
Oh shoot, I think it was March or April of 2015. So it's been about 7 or 8 years, and so forth. But really, I mean, I'm happy to kind of share my email address with folks.
Yep.
I mean,
I can put that in the show notes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now,
I mean,
am I allowed to put Choral Journal excerpts in the show notes, or do they not allow those to be shared?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I can find out.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I know that you can get Choral Journal. You know what? Isn't there like an archive on the ACDA website?
There is for members. There is, yeah.
So that's probably what I'll do. I'll just put the link, because there'd be a link, and then people can log in if they're members and be able to see that. That would be good. And then of course you've presented on this topic, I'm assuming. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I presented at various state conferences and so forth around the country. But the best learning tool for me has just been my students to try things and see what's worked, what hasn't worked, like we all do when we're learning something new. And I'll ask their feedback, and I'll say, so did that seem to work, and so forth. And you learn very quickly whether something worked or not, just by hearing from what they had to say, or listening to see if their performance was what you were kind of expecting. And so forth.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful final thought to wrap this up with. Gary, I really appreciate your time and your expertise and sharing all of this information with us.
Well, I appreciate having me, Chris. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of the episode. If you're still here, it means that you know the drill, the big things that you can do to help this show survive. And it does need continuous help from the audience in order to survive. And that is like, share, interact, leave ratings whenever you can in the podcast app on Facebook. And then, of course, join Choralosophy's Patreon subscriber group. That's where you volunteer to chip in a small amount of money each month. And that's patreon.com/Choralosophy. And then last but not least, and probably the biggest thing you can do is shop at the vendors that have promo codes. That's sightreadingfactory.com, ryanmain.com, graphitepublishing.com, and mymusicfolders.com. And every time you shop there, enter that Choralosophy checkout. Helps you, helps me. Thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see you next time.